press record and everything's running. I think we sound okay. I messed up my last episode. This episode, I promise I'm not gonna mess up. Hi Mujamma, it's good to have you back. I was saying this off mic, how although you've only done one episode, so I'm pretending like, oh, we've been doing a series of these, but this is your second. But I was thinking how there's something amazing about your episodes, and a few other people who have done this show have this same tendency. But you have this remarkable ability to get me to stop talking and listen, and not interrupt you with really that often, and also to just kind of tell a story, and tell it in a kind of straightforward way where you narrate like all the characters and you're very clear and the development, and you just kind of lay everything out of and so I felt like earlier it was like, oh, this is another episode of Tales of the Resistance with like Mujamma the storyteller. And so it sounds like I'm joking, but it really this is like a funny way to say thank you for all your work. Your blog has grown a lot since our first episode. It's I've seen you do a few episodes of other shows, friends of my show, Adnan Hussein, Resistance is Fertile. You wrote something for Electronic Intifada. So I want to applaud you. You're really you're doing some heroic work in terms of archival archival analysis, bringing this stuff that exists and has existed in Arabic, and bringing it to like a wider reading public in English. So I want to thank you and commend you for your work. And today's episode of Resistance Tales with Mujamma, we're talking about oh, why do I have these headphones on? I don't even need these headphones anymore. That's exciting. Oh God! So today we want to talk about an article you wrote. It's given that we're in the news, and given this show's special interest in all things Iran, especially lately, the story of Iran and Hamas's relationship and how it developed, and the interesting characters. So this article that I'm referencing. It is about, where is it? I should share it, but I don't know how to. You wrote it a couple of months ago. It's from April 2nd, 6 weeks ago, published April 2nd. It's titled How the Palestinian Islamic Resistance Movement, Hamas, which is the short form for Hamas, developed its relationship with Iran in Hajj Ramadan. So it's a fantastic piece. I encourage you all to go and read it. It's really full of stuff that I had never encountered before. Who knows? Maybe people out there know this stuff better, but it does feel like you are bringing this stuff to light for the first time. A lot of the stuff, at least in English. So maybe at the outset, you can sort of start with the kind of wider angle lens of this story before we get into the nitty-gritty. What do you think is something that you learned through your research that jumped out at you about Iran and the relationship between Iran and Hamas, and more generally the Palestinian resistance? But I guess this article is about Hamas specifically.
Well, thank you for having me very much on your podcast. It's a pleasure to be with you again. Something that I have often disputed is the broadly realist, offensive or defensive realist associated with, most famously, Mearsheimer, amongst others, that the realist position proffers how state actors in particular, are seeking power maximization, and thus their allegiances or their trust-based relationships tend towards those that assist or precipitate power maximization. This, however, oftentimes is unable to make sense of ideological actors. Now, there are not terribly many ideological actors in the contemporary world semblance, even when it comes to an actor like China or an actor like Russia, which may, in some sense, be ideologically opposed, at least in specific instances, to NATO, to the West. Nevertheless, they do, and this is something Mearsheimer has underscored, particularly in the case of China, broadly espouse realist politics for their industrialization and development. I don't think that this paradigm, this framework, can be extended to Iran and Iran's means of seeking allegiances or trust-based relationships with non-state actors. This is why I think from the ground up, the proxy talk is mistaken. I think any serious investigation of Iran's relationship with Hezbollah, with Hamas, with Palestinian Islamic Jihad, with Ansar Allah will illuminate that these are by no means proxies. They're by no means extensions of Iran's foreign policy, but that they operate autonomously, but they have common ideological frames of reference and therefore common interests. But those interests are not always material interests. That is one of the reasons, if not the primary reason, that the Islamic Republic of Iran has been sanctioned by the West, both primary and secondary, has been due to its support of resistance factions, especially Palestinian resistance factions. If it were exclusively seeking power maximization in the way that particularly offensive realists like Mearsheimer will underscore, then this would be a non-rational means of pursuing international relations and political allegiances. However, there is an ideological undergirding to Iran's behavior and Iran's trust-based relationships, and I think this is particularly pellucid with the case of Hamas, because there have been times where, particularly under Meshal's leadership, there were clashes, ideological
You're
clashes.
talking about, sorry, Mujamma, I promise not to interrupt you too much. You're talking about Khalid Mishal,
Yes.
the former head of, just in case, because people don't know the character, they might not know the characters as well as you do. So you're talking about Khalid Mishal, the former head of, or current head, possibly, not head. What is Mishal's
Khalid
role? Is he the
Meshal's
head?
current position is representative of the outside bloc of Hamas. So he is not the head of Hamas as such. There is no head currently. There is an executive committee, and there are currently elections being had for who will enjoy the position of the head. But the head of the Gaza bloc is Khalil al-Haya, and Khalil al-Haya, since he has been spearheading the negotiations, is oftentimes also considered the acting head of the executive council as well, though the executive council includes numerous members.
Okay, great. Sorry, I was sorry to keep going. I interrupted you.
So the point that I was making is, despite there have, particularly in regards to the Syria profile, the beginning of the Ansar Allah Yemen file, variations in positions, at least one that that showed a marked bifurcation between how those like Khalil al-Haya, Yahya Sinwar, Bassem Naim, and others sought to pursue Hamas's foreign policy, and then the other flank represented by Khalid Meshal, and a few other. Izzat al-Rishk is another one, Nazal is another one who's associated with the flank of Khalid Meshal. And since the latter, particularly before the 2017 internal elections between Hamas, was leading the party, that is, at that point, Khalid Meshal was indeed the head of the political bureau and thus the Hamas movement, there were differences, significant differences in terms of the foreign policy profile file with Iran, but nevertheless, Iran continued to give support and assistance, demonstrating that the ideological framework supersedes what the realists, and particularly offensive realists, would underscore, which is power maximization.
When you say power, when you say realists, can we also define that too? Because you're using a term that political scientists use, and famously. So maybe you could talk about that, because just in case we have people who come from comparative literature like me who are thinking about 19th century realism, that's not what you mean.
No, and it is also not realist in the philosophical sense or in the epistemological sense that that which one perceives is in some object independent way, the way objects truly are. The use of realist in international relations theory has broadly to do with this kind of power or material maximization. So, offensive realism is represented oftentimes by Mearsheimer, though not exclusively, but he, I think, is the clearest representative. And he contrasts his structural offensive realism, which stresses offensive or power maximizing behavior, with this more restrained defensive realism associated with Waltz. So the defensive realist assumption is that states are primarily concerned with preserving some existing balance of power rather than enlarging their share of power. And Mearsheimer, he states that power maximizers ultimately aspire to a systematic hegemony. So, as he puts it, the best way for a state to survive in an anarchic state of affairs, which is what he takes the state of nature to already be, a Hobbesian, Leviathan state of anarchy, is for that state to take advantage of other states and gain power at their expense. This often results in political actors forming trust-based allegiances, whereby they pay little attention to ideology as they search for allegiance partners. So Mearsheimer, he also underscores that when political actors do engage in this kind of trust-based behavior, they retain some healthy degree of suspicion. Their allegiances are what he calls temporary marriages of convenience, where today's allegiance partner may indeed be tomorrow's enemy, and today's enemy might be tomorrow's allegiance partner. I think when first describing this, one can readily think, this makes sense with how Iran behaves. It's trying to maximize power, and therefore these non-state actors like Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hasna Shabi, Ansar Allah, etc., they're means of power maximization. But I think that the facet that reveals why this framework is at odds with how Iran undertakes allegiances and trust-based behavior is because these allegiances are not temporary marriages of convenience. What would ultimately be more convenient for Iran would be to abdicate its relationship with some of these non-state actors, particularly with Hamas, at least with the Qassam brigades. One could say it could very well have a relationship like the so-called axis of moderation, Turkey and Qatar with Hamas. That is, it could support Hamas's political bureau's undertaking of infrastructure building projects within Gaza, as Qatar did before Tufan al-Aqsa, but it need not materially support, train, and finance the Qassam brigades as it does. Were it to do this, it is far less likely that it would incur the degree of sanctions that it does. Turkey does not incur sanctions. Qatar does not incur sanctions. So what is that which distinguishes the foreign policy of Iran from those two other states? It is its support of the Qassam brigades in particular and other militarized non-state actors like Hezbollah or Ansar Allah.
This is something that comes up a lot. I appreciate you kind of laying all this out. This is something that, and it came up in a couple episodes I just did. I mean, obviously it's a talking point. It's the question of, is it in Iran's interest to back the liberation of Palestine, right? Like, is it? I mean, that's the question. Basically, you said no. In according to the realist logic, I think you're right. I think if you think along those realist lines, that yeah, a rational actor would not pursue a strategy, would not pursue a foreign policy that places it in direct confrontation with the most violent corner of the global ruling class, right? That's like I'm correct in how you're stating it.
Yes.
Right. So, and I believe I actually believe that reading. However, this is one of those moments when you realize that like Western, and I think you were saying this too, that like the epistemological overlay or the structures or whatever metaphor, I don't know, scaffolding that political science in the West erect that are born out of Western imperial hegemonic like frameworks, right? Because when you're a political scientist in the West, your political theory will reflect that position. So you will think that, oh, all actors are like us. They pursue these politics, that it's, as you brought up, a Hobbesian battle between individuals. That's then people use as a metaphor for how societies are cobbled together, is this war against all of all against all, and they place that at a higher abstract level of abstractions. We say, oh, the same thing that's happening at the interpersonal level is happening at the international level between countries, between whatever, right? But the thing in here is that is it's both. It is true in the sense that it is in Iran's interest to back Palestine. There is a truth to that. It is in its interests. If its interests are rooted in decolonization and indigenous sovereignty over the region, right? Because that's part of that's part of how I think we get stuck in the arguments here. And I don't think you're saying that. I think you're saying that according to these Western logics, yeah, it doesn't make sense. Iran is not benefiting from its position on Palestine. However, beyond the sort of tectonics of these theories, Iran lives in an environment of imperial threat. Like the imperial threat is unfolding around it. Israel is a concatenation. Is that the word I'm looking for? Or I don't know, something. It's some congealing of a imperial threat into a country form that has been threatening and destabilizing all of its neighbors. And so the idea of reversing the process of its expansion, this is not in the interest of Iran. This is squarely in the interest of Iran. It's just not. It's just we have to break free of our thinking of interests, right? That I think that's the problem, is that we think along these lines of like Western imperial framework of what interests are. But here we're talking about two very fundamentally different kinds of foreign policy. A Westoid thinker, a person based in the West, is trying to make sense of a world where they live, and that world is aggressive all around it. A person based in the global South, a country based in Iran, is gonna fashion their own political thinking around the defense of sovereignty, and so obviously backing Palestinian liberation is a defense and a pursuing of the interests of Iranian sovereignty. It's just the cost of that is so high. So I think that if I don't know if we can continue down that line. I'm curious to hear how you feel about that kind of phrasing or sort of imagining. But also, it would be a good doorway to sort of open up to think about how these relationships actually developed, who they were, which is always what you do in your fantastic archival work.
So before moving on to the case study, perhaps of Hamas and particularly Hajj Ramadan and the IRGC, it might be worth distinguishing what I take to be two helpful models of interest, because the question sort of hangs on what is an interest for an individual, how does that scale up to the interest for a nation state, and how can those interests be accounted for in policy? And there's quite a bit in political philosophy that's written about this. The framework that I think is most amenable to the realist view, where the realist view doesn't actually talk about interests so much, is a political philosopher named Russell Hardin, and he has a theory called the encapsulated interest account. According to the encapsulated interest model, it, by the way, is opposed to models that are based in some attitude, some mental attitude, some propositional state where there's trusting or coming into an interest-based relationship vis-a-vis feeling, so how you feel or how you're disposed to feel in a certain way. The encapsulated interest model does not mandate some felt phenomenology. It avers that to do so would be unverifiable when you're dealing with an international actor. So, one of the strengths of this model is that it's explicitly designed to not only apply to individuals, but it's also supposed to help us explain the behavior of international actors, therein servicing our ability to describe and predict how they pursue cooperative foreign policies. And Hardin reiterates that I trust you because I think it's in your interest to take my interests in the relevant matter seriously. So you value the continuation of our relationship, and therefore you have your own interest in taking my interests into account. So I don't think that this is the kind of interest-based model that Iran pursues. I think it's belief not in the continuation of a relationship, nor in some psychological fact, but instead it is anchored in a worldview. And I think that worldview remains broadly static. It's not contingent on historical states of affairs. It may take different forms or different shapes depending on the historical state of affairs, but its commitment, in this case, for instance, to Palestinian liberation remains static, regardless of those states of affairs.
I guess I want to talk about static, what the meaning of static is, just quickly, but we should get. I would be nice to unlock some of these the narrative that you've put together. But just explain what you mean in static, because you mean it's a principle. You mean static in terms of its principled stance, like that doesn't change.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a more, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, it's always been in Palestine. It's always been in Iranian interests, in the interest of the Islamic Republic. Let's put it that way. Which, as a certain state, which is like a state formation or whatever you want to call it. You tell me. You're the political scientist, not me. But that's a sovereignty is something that it's pursuing, and this is also could I guess before we can get on, is that part of the problem here? Is that a lot of the language, at least coming from this part of the world that I'm in, is that there's actually like there's very little recognition that most states don't have sovereignty. Like it seems to me like among liberal theorists there's a great assumption of agency on the part of the countries of the world, that it's only the Marxists who talk about imperialism. It's only those weirdo anti-imperialists that talk about that. But all of them, they talk about like the countries like are actors, but not all actors are the same in the global framework, right? And Iran's nature of being an actor is like the worst case scenario, because it's an actor who pursues a foreign policy, irrespective of like the West's dictates. In those, pursuing its interests in that foreign policy unlocks other countries to pursue those interests together with it. So it's like an enabling force in a wider project of resistance. So yeah, I'm curious. Yeah, so that thing about static, that's what you mean. Yeah.
Though one could, of course, here object and say, well, it's perhaps in Iran's long-term interests insofar as this is something that someone perhaps like Mearsheimer would argue, that it's in Iran's long-term interests because if there is a liberated Palestine, Iran's having invested in the procedure that results in this liberated Palestine will be such that it has secured an allegiance and the trading partner, an ally of sorts, and that it has in so doing curried favor with the Arab street on the road to this liberated Palestine. I think one could, however, rejoinder that despite this might, from the realist view, makes sense, it is also at odds with much of how the Arab Street has historically, in the near past, in the recent past, viewed Iran, unfortunately, that there has been quite a bit of effect that programs like Al Jazeera, to some degree, even Middle East Eye, Turkish media to some degree as well, at least those like TRT, less Anadolu Ajansi, which has been a bit more favorable. And really, the polls do show that the Turkish street is much more favorable, in fact, to Iran. But in terms of the Arab street, there is at least some dissension based on the polling, even based on PCPSR's polling of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Al-Quds, that there are distinct views towards Iran, that there's favorability perhaps in one area but not in another. So I do think that this then brings a bit of a counter argument to what those like Mir Shamir might argue, and therefore really what we have to redound on is indeed the ideological commitment. I cannot hear you.
I muted myself. Let's talk about another way of phrasing that ideological commitment is, it's not exactly the same thing, but at least it's somewhat a kind of doorway to the next part of the conversation, which is theory versus praxis, right? And so like the talk of being a liberationist state, like liberationist theory, that the project of the Islamic Republic emerges from, is not just a theory talk. It's not just like spoken. It's enacted. So I do think that it is in line with the larger project of Velayat Fari, like recognizing that kind of anti-imperialist, anti-oppressive, liberationist element of 12. I mean, maybe not just 12er Shiaism, because the Yemenis, they're not 12er Shia. But so maybe it's a kind of the larger understanding how Shiaism plays in this too, because can you make the argument that another problem that Westoid theory has is they simply can't fathom a religious dimension to realist interests, that to them it's all just dollars and cents, that it's just pure materialism, whereas the like Al-Quds is an important site to these people, to these actors. It's not just like another city. I mean, it's also true with the Zionists too. So like, I guess, is there, and really we should get into the actors, but is there could that be part of the problem too?
Undoubtedly, I think that the ideological component, if it is not born out from material pursuits and material power maximization, then we have to ask, well, what is it born out of? And from here, one can only appeal, I think, to some framework. The framework that the IRI is bolstered on, that the Islamic Republic of Iran develops out of, is one of political Shiism. So I think that undoubtedly you're right. Now, insofar as other actors are concerned, I think that more broadly political Islam is the focal point for where many of the liberationist strands, be it that of Shikaki, the founder of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, comes from, or Abu Shabab, who was something of the movement philosopher prior to his martyrdom in Hamas. There's differences, of course, theological differences between political Shiism and political Sunnism, but nevertheless, there are common figures that both appeal to, Qutb being one of them, al-Banna being another. And so there's undoubtedly a political Islam framework that I don't think many of Western analysts are able to account for. There are some that do account for it. Joran Gunning, for instance, has a very good book where he is able to account for it, and he has an even better, in my opinion, doctoral thesis insofar as this subject is concerned. I'll recommend it. It's called
Can you spell
Rethinking.
the name?
Yes. So Joran, J-E-R-O-E-N. Surname is Gunning, G-U-N-N-I-N-G. And the title of the doctoral thesis is Rethinking Western Constructs of Islamism, Pluralism, Democracy, and the Theory and Praxis of the Islamic Movement in the Gaza Strip. It's based on several years that Gunning spent in Gaza interviewing many of the movement's leaders at the time. It also includes interviews with Haniyeh, with lesser known names as well, but it broadly concerns these various views that political scientists had preceding this doctoral thesis espoused, represented by those like Beverly Milton Edwards, who were political modernists, therein believing that what political progress consists in is increasing secularism, a tendency towards a kind of democracy that has its apotheosis in the Westphalian Western model. And then there are political pluralists. These were represented by those like Khaled Hrub, and these believe that there can be facets of what the modernist model espouses. For instance, they often appeal to Mill and Jean Stuart Mill and this idea of free debate, the idea that one can have an inclusionism. So communists, for instance, have the right to vote, stand for election, and express their opinions concerning economics, politics, and morality. Same with Christian communities. This is the belief that a political community can include different groups, different ideological actors, but that broadly the model itself, the political model, including that inclusionism, is shaped by the Islamic movement's appeal to a kind of political Islam. And that's what Gunning's argument ultimately consists in, though it is comprised of quite a bit of specific on-the-ground states of affairs, interviews. I recommend it highly.
Okay, great. So let's get into the characters. Who was Haji Ramadan?
Yes, so I think that one of the ways to best understand who he was is to consider how he was lionized by those who eulogized him in the resistance. There were many eulogies produced, and they all lauded him as one of the leaders, if not the leader of the axis of resistance vis-a-vis Palestine. He was called the Great Martyr of Palestine. He was born in 1964 in Sonkor, Iran, but he spent a great deal of time, many decades, in southern Lebanon. But so this Great Martyr of Palestine honorary title, which was bestowed upon him by Hamas Al-Qassam brigades and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, bestowed upon this major general, his name being Mohammed Said Izadi. This title, it reveals just how valuable a role he held. The choice of title also embodies the extent to which he was esteemed within the resistance axis. So he was in charge of increasing the Iranian IRGC financial budget allocated to Hamas. And he was also in direct contact with Palestinian factions in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, not just Hamas, but also Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, and other smaller groups. One of Hajj Ramadan's most important characteristics was that throughout any tumultuousness within the axis of resistance, he had a sincere and continuous communication with Palestinian factions and with leaders like Al-Daif. This can be seen in the various statements that were produced and the letters that have been leaked. despite differences maybe on the Syria file, the Major General, with the support of Hajj Qasem Soleimani, bridged those differences, and they never allowed these to strain relations with Hamas. He also distinguished himself by always avoiding any contentious issues concerning Shiism, Sunnism, and emphasized unity. A statement of condolences from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement on the martyrdom of Hajj Ramadan read, we knew that the great martyr Izadi, as a symbol of the resistance, who spent his life supporting the Palestinian people, their cause and their resistance. He made noble and great contributions in providing all means of support and assistance to the resistance movements in Palestine and the region over many years, distinguished by a brilliant leadership mind, a penetrating strategic vision, and a spirit of jihad filled with determination, steadfastness, and resolve. The Hamas movement also had a lionizing statement, and they referred to him as the martyred leader who was one of the pillars of support for the Palestinian resistance movements across all their fields and arenas. He worked day and night in support of the Palestinian cause and made great efforts to strengthen our people's capabilities and their resistance against the Zionist enemy until he became a martyr on this path. In addition to this, and I won't read every eulogy, but there were numerous statements that were published by individuals, including those who lead, like al-Nakhala in the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or Khalil al-Haya, who was one of the acting executive committee heads alongside Mohammed Darwish, Zahir Jaberin, Nizar Awadallah, and Khalid Mishal. Khalil al-Haya wrote a very thoughtful obituary as well, so this is just demonstrative of how beloved a figure he was. Although not much was known about him during the decades in which he had pursued relations with the axis of resistance, I will here recommend a book that is, to my knowledge, the only text that engages with some sustained research to this relationship. It is by Fatima al-Samadi, and the title is Iran and Hamas, from Marj al-Zuhur to the Al-Aqsa Flood. It was published in 2024. Unfortunately, the book is only in Arabic. It has not been translated yet. But if you like, we can turn to the historical development of this relationship and the particulars.
Yeah, let's do it, because there's a lot of history here, and it goes. It's you started with his involvement in Lebanon.
Yes, so I think that before one actually turns to Hajj Ramadan, one should consider the preceding history just very briefly, if you don't mind. So the relationship between Iran and Hamas, it precedes the relationship actually between the established figureheads, because it actually precedes the establishment of Hamas in 1987. So, and this is per Hossein Sheikh al-Islam, who was a prominent Iranian diplomat, and he was one of the most influential figures in the political in the political coterie around the resistance in Iran, who fostered the relationship with particularly the Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement. He said that in an interview that Iran had initially reached out to what was a burgeoning Islamic movement in Palestine through diplomatic channels, and that this took place in the years before the formation of Hamas. Mojtaba Abtahi, who would become the Secretary General for the Iran conference in support of the First Intifada in the early 1990s, he was actually the first official in Iran to meet with a delegation from the Islamic movement, specifically from the facet of the Islamic movement associated with Mujamma al-Islamiyya, Sheikh Yassin's civil services infrastructure. And this meeting took place in 1985 in Cyprus, in a hotel. It was attended by some 9 men and 6 women who came from various regions of Palestine, and some of them came from the occupied 1948 territories. One figure, Sheikh Darwish, Abdullah Nimer Darwish, he sent a representative. We know that another sheikh who was residing in Jordan, he sent a representative. His name was Sheikh Al-Tamimi. And over the course of the First Intifada, a few other follow-up meetings were held in Algiers, Istanbul, and Ankara. These are the first meetings that are between Iranian delegations and what was then coalescing and following the First Intifada coalesced into Hamas. But during this period, there was no official relationship. There was not material support yet. According to Sheikh al-Islam, Iran's work with Hamas in the very beginning was a result of a decision made by Ayatollah Khamenei, and it was based on a recommendation that came from him, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the IRGC Quds Force. Well, the IRGC Quds Force hadn't actually yet been established, but the IRGC's external intelligence work, which later became the Quds Force. And so the Ministry of Foreign Affairs studied this recommendation, and afterwards Khamenei, who at that point was serving as Imam Khomeini's representative on the Palestinian cause in Lebanon, reviewed it. After Hamas emerged in 1987, there were extensive discussions as to how support might be granted for this burgeoning political Islam movement. And the leadership settled that what would make the most sense would be to have some kind of established contact with Hamas. So this was formally pursued, but Hamas, at the first points of contact, did not cede to the meetings. It did not show much enthusiasm. It was very suspicious of any outside political actors, particularly because, according to some interviews, it still associated Iran with the previous era, the Shah era, and therefore met broadly these appeals with suspicion, so it didn't take them up. Then Iran continued to formally initiate contact over the next few years with specific political bureau members. And according to Ali Asghar Mohammadi, there were different points of view within the Iranian leadership during this point. Some thought that establishing ties with the movement should be pursued. Others thought that they should wait until the end of the Intifada. The Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, nevertheless, he initiated relations. Ali Akbar Velayati and Sheikh al-Islam, they all played these leading roles. And there were contacts made with some representatives. But he even says, that is, Mohammadi says, I heard from them and they were suspicious. Later, Mohammad al-Zahar, who was one of the leaders of the political bureau and associated with the flank that was very much of a piece with the axis of resistance, said that these misgivings, they were anchored in the political dynamics that Iran and other Arab states that oppose it, particularly in the Gulf, espoused. According to Abu Marzouk, another leader within Hamas, although the Palestinian Islamic Jihad had established connection, a close connection, and was receiving at this point ideological and material support from Iran. It wasn't until the leader, the Secretary General of PIJ, Fatih Shikaki, appealed to Hamas that Hamas opened up to Iran. It was really Shikaki's urging that prompted this relationship to begin to blossom. So Iran used one of its channels to establish a meeting in 1990. The details concerning this meeting are pretty limited, but Abu Marzouk does say in an interview that he was in the United States, and a diplomat who had a connection to the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs contacted him, that there was a lengthy discussion, but this resulted in preparation for the initial meeting, where the Iranian side was represented by Homayun Alizadeh and Asghar Mohammadi, and that he, Marzouk, participated in this meeting alongside Khalil al-Kuka, who represented Hamas. And this, believe it or not, took place at a hotel in the United Arab Emirates. It's a very different UAE than the UAE of today.
Damn, really?
Yes.
The Abraham Accords country?
Yes, but this was the time of the father of the MBZ, Sheikh Zayed as he was called, and there is this famous, perhaps you have seen it, meeting between Sheikh Yassin and Sheikh Zayed, where Sheikh Zayed says one cannot trust the Zionist entity. They are solely interested in bolstering their own agenda, that they are a dangerous political entity, that no Arab country, no Muslim can have relations with. He condemned any possible normalization. He was a principled actor, it actually seems, and so where the apple falls from certainly is not this tree.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. That's a diplomatic. It's a far more diplomatic way than I would have put it.
Indeed, it's very difficult to imagine that the United Arab Emirates could have served as the site of this initial meeting. But after that meeting, the Iranian side noted that they were interested in developing this relationship, that they would be supportive in any way that was possible. And they expressed their eagerness to establish relationships at this point with all of the Palestinian factions, but were particularly interested in Hamas over the course of the First Intifada, because A, there were common roots with Qutb, al-Banna, and Khomeiniism, Khomeini having lauded these figures in his own writing, but also because it increasingly saw the popularity gained by the Hamas movement. So the Iranians asked the Hamas delegation about the vision for confronting the occupation, as well as what might be ambiguous points based on the statements that Hamas had produced up to that point. And the statement that was produced in this meeting, verbatim, is, if we liberate a single inch, we will establish the state of Palestine upon it. Then the movement expressed that it was not willing to reconcile with this kind of normalization wrought by the Madrid-Oslo process. At the end of that meeting, Alizadeh offered Hamas Iran's readiness to financially support it, and the movement's delegation was at that point using Abu Marzouk as the point of contact. However, it should be noted that due to the Iraq war, due to the Iran-Iraq war, soon the amount of financial assistance that it was able to render was limited by the financial state of Iran. In fact, the foreign minister and director of the Middle East Department, Mohammad Hazem Harari, he offered his sincere apologies to the Hamas movement, and Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani had at this point launched a series of reconstruction and economic liberalization projects that increasingly meant there was not a budget to pursue these kinds of relationships. So, according to Fatima al-Samadi, who recounts this period, although the movement's relationship, that is Hamas's relationship, with Rafsanjani was good, due to the consequences of the Iran-Iraq war, the Iranian Foreign Ministry, which had previously provided significant political support to Hamas, was unable to meet its need for money and weapons. And the assistance that it could provide was limited and was restricted to covering office expenses in Tehran and limited financial aid. However, those obstacles were gradually overcome as the dossier was transferred to the Revolutionary Guards, and they became responsible for managing the relationship. And it's in 1992, in September 1992, when the Hamas Political Bureau, at that point led by Abu Marzouk, visited Tehran for the first time. And this is when the delegation meets with Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, President Rafsanjani, Ali Akbar Nategnuri, who was the speaker for the Consultative Assembly, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, as well as then commander of the Revolutionary Guards, Mohsen Rezai. And this is when the Hamas movement gives its principled opposition, articulates its principled opposition to the peace process. According to witness accounts, this was instrumental in securing support.
Sorry, I keep losing. There's 15,000 tabs. Wait, so we jumped around a little bit in time, which is fine. We did a trajectory because we went from the early meetings, I think, or with some of the early meetings, and then we ended up at, because Rafsanjani's rise is 89, I think. That's his presidency, I think. Something like that. So you're saying in the era of Rafsanjani, there was a tightening of the belts of the purse strings, so to speak, and which I've heard the same, but I'm curious though in all of this, there is a parallel track. I mean, not to get us, I don't want to derail us at all, but there is a parallel story unfolding, which is the evolution of Hezbollah, right, in South Lebanon. So at the same time, these contacts are being made with the movement in Palestine. The development of Hezbollah is taking place on a parallel track. Correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
And Rafsanjani, he was president from, I believe, August 1989 until 1997. And so this period is taking place in that 1989 to 1991 approximately. It's in 1992 that the southern Lebanon expulsion to Marj al-Zuhur takes place, and really when military support rather than financial, diplomatic, and economic support takes place. But yes, so this is also incidentally when the first real contacts with Hezbollah began to take place with Hamas, though Hezbollah's own contacts with Iran preceded this, of course.
Thanks for that. Sorry. I just want to make that clear, because these co-availing strategies of linking up different resistance movements and, let's say, providing technical and leadership and kind of organizational nourishment to them at various stages is something that that's part of the understanding of Iran. If Iran were going to have proxies, they wouldn't have developed. The idea of Iran developing proxies is just so laughable to me. Like, come on, man. Do you think Iran has the pockets even to run proxies. Like it's such a, whereas it's much cheaper to just, it's much more straightforward as a state to find allies, because allies will do a much better job than proxies. Proxies are what the imperialists do. Proxies are what the Yemeni state was against Ansar Allah, before that the Houthis. So this is why I want to bring this up, that point around Iran's development of these various fronts and finding allies and developing them and nourishing them with technical and sort of educational assistance. Yeah.
So I would note that in the case of Hezbollah, the emergence of Hezbollah and the close relationship it enjoys with Iran precedes even at least in terms of the ideological components and the specific individual to individual relationships, precedes even 1979. You can trace it back to the urbanization of the Lebanese Shia in the late 1950s in Lebanon, and this is something that Amal Saad Goharab she makes in her book, that it was this extreme deprivation of the long neglected rural peripheries in the south and Bekaa and the migration to the Beirut core that also allowed for increasingly a kind of consciousness of political Shiism in this urban context. And it's a comprehensive book. Perhaps you've already read it, but your readers would do well to certainly read this book. I think that its title is Hezbollah, Politics and Religion. And that really traces back how the fountainhead of Hezbollah was not even located in Lebanon, but in the religious academies of Nafaq in Iraq, where hundreds of these young Lebanese Shia had studied in the early 1960s under the tutelage of Al-Sadr is one of the most important figures, but there's also this interesting period about the Ba'ath Party's assumption of power and how then these Lebanese students were expelled, and this too undergirds the points of contact. So with the Islamic movement in Palestine and Hamas, it does take place significantly later, such that there was already, and this is significant to the discussion we're having, that there was already an infrastructure in place to assume space for this flank. So, shall we move on then to Marj al-Zuhur? So, Hamas appointed someone by the name of Imad al-Alami as its first representative in Iran and opened its first office in Tehran in February 1992. By the end of 92, he had to leave Tehran due to arrangements between Hamas and Jordan, and that resulted in many of the movement's leaders settling in Amman. And in early 1993, Osama Hamdan, who many know today, I would say Osama Hamdan is again representative of one of these figures who's very close with the axis of resistance. He became the Hamas representative in Tehran, and in 1998 he was succeeded by Abu Muhammad Mustafa, who held the post until 2001. From 2001 until 2010, it's been occupied. It was occupied by Abdul Muti Zakut, who served as the Hamas representative in Iran. He then left for Yemen, and then from 2010 to today, it's Khalid al-Kadumi, who represents the Hamas movement in Tehran. This is just to show that there's a continuity in political relationships and the political bureau's relationship with Iran. But the real point of Qassam-based support takes place in southern Lebanon, in Marj al-Zuhur, after some 415 representatives of political Islam are expelled from Palestine. So this is also when the relationship with Hajj Ramadan begins to take place.
Wait, so they're expelled in the context of Oslo stuff?
So yes, but there's also a bit more of a militarized facet to it. So in the around the beginning of December of 1992, and really, you should, to properly understand this history, consider that this is the peak of perhaps the end of the First Intifada, but this is also when it's the peak of Al-Qassam undertaking specific operations that are targeting what were civilian sites occupied by military figures. And so these are operations that are quite focused. And on 4 December 1992, there's a Qassam cell that undertakes preparations for an operation that is to strike the occupation's military and its region-specific centers. They do a number of forward observation, intelligence gathering, assessments, and they estimate the speed at which assistance would arrive were an attack undertaken. They undertake patrols in various areas. So this is also when intelligence collection is being undertaken. On 7 December 1992, there's a cell that attacks the occupation's military, and specifically its vehicle, which was carrying army reservists, 3 of whom were killed. The attack relied on intelligence and insights that had been gathered over the course of this past week. And according to assessments that were produced by the Zionist entity, when the planning of the attack was undertaken, it had been determined that there would be a quick response so that there would have to be a succession of attacks in order for it to have the maximum impact. In the days that led up to this attack, scouting and forward observation teams by the resistance had been sent out to gather intelligence that was collated. A jeep that was identified that drove down the road east of the Gaza Strip and was connected to the Beit Lahia checkpoint of the military police station, and had 3 combatants, occupation combatants, with 3 enlisted soldiers and 2 enlisted soldiers and 1 officer in a jeep that was behind it, became the points of the sites that were targeted. As the jeep drove in one direction, another patrol drove in the opposite, and this is something that is chronicled in several important texts, including one that's called the Hamas Intelligence War Against Israel, recently published by a Zionist author, but nevertheless it is illuminating. It was published by Cambridge University Press in 2024. The author of it is Nathaniel Flamer, and the reason I mention how these jeeps were precisely attacked is because this indicated to the occupation that there was intelligence capacity. In a post-attack debriefing, the cell members learned that the occupation had what the occupation had to say about the attack as well. They had some contacts within occupied Palestine that were able to pass along this kind of assessment. And so after studying it, these cells, they came to understand how the reservists, by observing a letter within the Nahal unit, they began to pick out specific names and specific decision makers within the reserve units to be targeted. On 13 December, this leads up to the capture and then assassination of Sergeant Major Nissim Toledano, who was within the Zionist entity's military border guard. On 13 December, after this capture, Hamas offers his safe return in exchange for the release of Sheikh Yassin. The occupation does not oblige, and Toledo's body is later found in the West Bank. Over the subsequent years, by the way, this incident is followed up by a number of armed attacks that are informed by the capture of such figures for exchanges, the most notable being a series, and these are also combined with intelligence assessments that involve reservist units and figures within reservist units based on forward observation intelligence gathering. One of the most notable is a series of bus bombings in retaliation to the Hebron massacre of 1994. But just sticking with 1992 and this December period, on 17 December 1992, following this kidnapping and assassination of Sergeant Toledano by the Qassam brigades, the occupation expels 415 Palestinian Islamic leaders to South Lebanon in Marj al-Zuhur. And this is, so the real background, more than Oslo, is specifically this First Intifada intelligence gathering based, more precise targeting, and also the attempt to have prisoner exchanges to free the prisoners. So
thank you for that. That was good to know. It's interesting that they would send them all to the same town. It's like, okay, let's create a resistance university for them.
That's precisely what happens. They really do call it a university.
Yeah.
They create a legitimate university there.
Yeah, I mean that's yeah, Zionists they dig their own grave in a sense. Their hubris and their insistence. They could have just left those guys there, but I guess this insistence on moving people and displacing people and flexing and saying that, oh, you're not allowed to have these people, it only helps connect and link up revolutionary and like resistance forces in the end. Yeah, it's interesting.
And so here, Yitzhak Rabin, he issues an authorization 97. It's interesting that during this period, and there is some continuity here with how the entity continues to behave, but it always tries to come up with a legal justification. With authorization 97, it grants military commanders in the occupied territory the authority to expel, quote, inciters, unquote, from the population of the locality. And this is what the commander in charge of Gaza, Brigadier General Matan Vilnai, undertakes. He issues what is called Military Order 1086. It amends an article 112 of the 1945 Defense Emergency Regulations, which applies both to Gaza and the West Bank. It relaxes the then extant procedural restraints concerning deportations, and it allows expulsions to take place before any appeal can be filed within the entity's legal system. Even so, the military commanders, they avoided using the term deportation. They called it temporary removal. In response, the United States' government, it issued a statement noting that the deportation, as they said, the US here was, it should be noted, not as sycophantic as it is today, but nevertheless did grant legitimacy to this. The US government issues a statement that the deportation of individuals from the occupied territory was a violation of Article 94 of the Geneva Conventions, and that any of the, quote, criminals, unquote, should be tried before a court. But among those who had been expelled to Marj al-Zuhur in southern Lebanon were Hamas's major leaders at the time. It include Abdelaziz al-Rantisi, Abdel Fattah al-Dukhan, who, by the way, was the author of the famed Hamas Charter, or Al-Mithaq, as it's called by the movement, Abu Aymara Taha, as well as Kutla Islamic Bloc, student Islamic Bloc leader, who was the, Islamic Bloc student leader, and who became the president of the Islamic University of Gaza's Student Council in 1998. I mention this because this is one of the figures that was very important in creating the university that was established for approximately a year in southern Lebanon and served as a site of intellectual exchange, not only amongst members of the Palestinian resistance who previously had never met one another, because, again, West Bank and Gaza are involved, but also was important because it served as a site of intellectual exchange between various members of the Hezbollah and of IRGC and Hamas. So these are just some of the important figures. It should also be noted that 3 days after the expulsion, the exiles announced that they refused to accept their expulsion and they demanded to be allowed to return. And they staged what they called a return march. So you might be familiar with the Great March of Return that occurs in 2018, 2019, but this is in fact the first return march that is staged as this form of peaceful protest. The operation was planned in coordination with the Lebanese army, who entered the camp and demanded that the Palestinian deportees be returned to their country. As the exiled leaders reached the Zumriya crossing, the Zionist occupation, began firing on them. The deportees then stopped in their tracks and began to pray as the Zionist entity continued to shoot. Adnan al-Maswadi, a doctor from Hebron, recalled having to abandon his prayers and attend to a young man, Amjad Zamil, who had been shot in the face. And this is chronicled by Al Zaytuna Center, an academic resource / kind of think tank that concerns Palestinian history and the resistance in particular. But this is all just to say that there was quite a bit of political galvanization. It's also perhaps worth noting before turning to Hajj Ramadan that one of Hamas's movement leaders from the West Bank, Jamal Mansour, recalled that in the early stages, global broadcasters like Radio Monte Carlo had refused to name Hamas, despite the movement had offered to speak with the station to report on the story and to even pay the station to report on the story. But this matter changed soon after the United States' television networks requested an interview with Hamas leaders. This is chronicled by someone by the name of Borini, who has a small text called Marj al-Zahur, published in 2012. But on Christmas night in 1992, Larry King of CNN, he was a presenter, famed, well-known presenter on CNN. He hosted Aziz Dweck, who was a leader within Hamas, live from Marj al-Zuhur, which provided many international audiences with their first image of political Hamas leadership. And what they discovered was highly educated scientists, engineers, doctors, and scholars, at odds with the images that the Zionist media had previously projected. And on 15 August 1993, about 8 months after they had been left in Lebanon, a group within Hamas accepted a proposal which allowed for half of the members to return and the remainder to return in December 1993. So the first group of about 180 returned in early September 1993 after the first Oslo Accord had been signed, and most were allowed to return home, but some were detained upon their crossing the border by the Zionist occupation. And the second group returned on 14 December 1993, which it should be noted, this process also involved quite a bit of coordination between Musa Abu Marzouk and Arafat, who had to coordinate the deportees' return. And there were a series of talks between the PLO and Hamas following a request from Hamas leaders in Amman. But now we can turn to Hajj Ramadan if you like, now that the background is set.
Let's do it.
So, Hajj Ramadan had already at this point established himself in the Beirut suburb of Haraket, which functioned as a command center for the Lebanese resistance / the IRGC, which was in contact with the Lebanese resistance. But during the point of the late 1980s, he was also in contact with some of those figures aforementioned in Iran who had already had political points of contact with the Hamas movement. Now, during this phase of the late 1980s, Hajj Ramadan also engaged with Palestinian representatives in Lebanon, including those who were part of what's known as the Follow-up Committee for Palestinian Forces in Lebanon, which included representatives from various factions. Those factions included Fatah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PFLP, DFLP. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, this involvement consisted of, it should be noted, a Catholic with a lowercase c, an ecumenical number of groups. So this was demonstrative of the unity-based outlook. But it is really 17 December 1992, the expulsion after this capture and elimination of Sergeant Nissim Toledano by the Qassam brigades, where 415 Palestinian leaders and activists from Gaza, West Bank, and Al-Quds are expelled to Marj al-Zuhur, that the leadership within Hamas's Gaza and West Bank factions forms a closer connection. Now, that group included a lot of currents, yes, not just Hamas, but Hamas made the thumping majority. It was 356 Hamas members. And again, this was including figures, leaders like Rantisi, Dweck. There's also others like Mahmoud al-Zahar and Ismail Haniya who were expelled. There were about 53 who belonged to Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and then there were some independent figures and individuals associated with the small political Islam movement within occupied Palestine. One of those important figures was Bassam Jarar. But within the camp, those who had been deported organized themselves into separate tents based on their party affiliation, and Hajj Ramadan's introduction to the southern Lebanon camp was chronicled as follows. So, according to a witness account, Iran seized the opportunity presented by the presence of so many Islamic resistance cadres in Marj al-Zuhur, where they established direct contact with Hamas and succeeded in gaining the trust of the Palestinian resistance. The Lebanese Hezbollah played an influential role in building trust between the two sides. The Iranians were eager to establish broader ties with the Hamas movement, and Mojtaba Abtahi's meetings in Aranka, Algeria, Ankara, and Italy were not sufficient to achieve this. Marj al-Zuhur was the opportunity the Iranians had been looking for, recalls Abtahi, who kept a photo archive of this period. The Iranians dealt with educated leaders, as the Marj al-Zuhur camp included 20 university professors, 25 doctors, and more than 60 engineers from various age groups who demonstrated boldness in expressing their positions even where disagreements might lie. Now, it should be noted that although at first this was just political points of contact that were limited broadly to Marj al-Zuhur, within the next few months after 1991 meeting with Ali Akbar Velayati had already laid the groundwork for these diplomatic sorts of relationships. And after Marj al-Zuhur broadened the political relationships, a military relationship transpired. Now, it's also notable that this military relationship itself was not circumscribed to Marj al-Zuhur. It involved cadres within the Al-Qassam brigades going to Syria, going to Iran, and receiving military training. Not just military training in how to use weapons, but also in how to build weapons. Hajj Ramadan spent a total of 13 months with the deportees. He ate with them, he slept with them, and he sat with them, he conversed with them, he provided medical assistance where possible, bringing doctors from Beirut and helping organize visits with family members when family members from Gaza or West Bank would travel to the border. This was an arduous process, but Hajj Ramadan, to the best of his abilities, facilitated these kinds of meetings. But it's also notable that, as Sheikh Naim Qasim indicated in his eulogy after the martyrdom of Hajj Ramadan, he also provided military training to the exiled Palestinians. We don't know exactly who he provided military training to, but we do know that this military training made its way to informing what Hassan Salema, Qassam member, pursued as the so-called sacred revenge operations following the engineer Yahya Ayash's martyrdom on 5 January 1996. That is, the kinds of explosive instruments that Hajj Ramadan and subsequently the IRGC provided with the Qassam brigades allowed them to hone their means of creating explosives that would then be used in these operations, martyrdom operations in particular, during the mid-1990s. It should also be noted that Iran, when the question was broached as to whether there could be undertaken training and preparation of resistance fighters, organized courses for what is said to be dozens of exiles, and those dozens of exiles then went on to also train others. So there's this downstream kind of effect. And although indeed the Iranians had offered to train members before this, this is the point at which that training transpired. So this is the most critical, I think, period of the development of the military connection. And if you please, we can name or go over the specific kinds of operations that were undertaken.
Let's do it.
Okay, so this outcome of this period involved expertise in explosive manufacturing, as I noted. And we see the effects of this in the mid-1990s. Qassam here began booby-trapping cars and manufacturing explosive belts which were used in martyrdom operations. One of the most notable is the 19 October 1994 bus number 5 explosion on Dizengoff Street in so-called Tel Aviv, which resulted in the elimination of 22, in addition to the martyrdom of the bomber, and the wounding of 48 people. And then the 5 August 1995 bombing of the bus number 26 in Al-Quds's Ramat Eshkol, which resulted in 5 being eliminated and 73 being injured, this being one of the larger casualties. Following Yahya Ayash's assassination, the aforementioned assassination, on the 5th of January, one of the Qassam leaders, Hassan Salama, commenced what are now known as, or what were then introduced as, the Sacred Revenge Operations. After the release of Salama in March 1992, he had moved between several countries, which included Iran, Syria, Sudan, and Libya, and he had participated in various military training courses, including those that were organized by the IRGC. And this prefigured his manufacturing of explosive devices for these revenge operations. The first of these included a 25 February 1996 operation by Majdi Abu Warda, which this, by the way, is following the Baruch Goldstein Ibrahimi Mosque massacre. This is on 25 February 1994 itself, and it serves as a catalyzing, or better put, perhaps compounding incident, which further precipitates the retaliation that the Al-Qassam brigades undertake. And so there's a martyrdom mission that targets a bus in occupied Al-Quds that results in 24 settlers being eliminated, 13 occupation soldiers included, and wounding of more than 15 others. This is followed by Ibrahim al-Sharhanana's operation, in which, also wearing an explosive belt, he sets out for a bus station in the city of Ashkelon, and his martyrdom, which had targeted a bus that included occupation soldiers, a high number of them, resulted in dozens of casualties. A few days after this, Raid Shaghnubi undertook another operation where 19 settlers were killed and 10 wounded, and this was followed up by an operation by Ramaz Obead of PIJ, who went to the Dizengoff shopping center in so-called Tel Aviv, and he eliminated 13 and 120 were wounded. Then director or then head of the Shabak of the Shin Bet, Avi Dichter, he said that these operations constituted a strategic threat, those were his words, to the occupation. And so this, for many who chronicle the military history of the Palestinian resistance, see it as a qualitative shift, this period as an important qualitative shift, because of the military expertise that Salama, in constructing these explosive belts in particular, following his training in Iran, Lebanon, Syria, and Libya, was able to pass down. And of course, when in 2005, the martyrdom operations are abandoned by Al-Qassam and the resistance more broadly, one still sees how the manufacturing of explosives continues, albeit in different weapons. It should also be noted here that the martyrdom operation manner of proceeding was itself something that Hezbollah had pursued quite significantly. So this is something that we see not only limited to Hamas/Al-Qassam, but also to the broader axis of resistance at the time. So if you like, we can move on to the post-Marja al-Zuhur period of contact between Hajj Ramadan and the Palestinian resistance.
Let's do it.
So this is the period that we unfortunately don't have as much about. Marja al-Zuhur has been written about by various scholars and various witness accounts and interviews. But this period, understandably, has been more clandestine. But there are some punctuated periods, and we know that the interactions did continue with Hajj Ramadan. The activities included continued military and logistical as well as financial assistance, with Hajj Ramadan's main position being one of providing financial resources. So there is, if you are maybe familiar with, and this is again a Zionist resource, so it should be, I think, treated as a hermeneutic object, that is an object which one approaches both with suspicion, but specifically treats as expressing not necessarily a historical record, but instead a point of view that the entity wants to be communicated. However, it's titled Captured Documents Show Iranian Support for Hamas in the Gaza Strip. It was published in December 2024. It includes what are claimed to be letters between various members of Hamas and Iran. It was published by the so-called Amit Terrorism and Intelligence Research Institute based in the occupied Palestine. And here there is a letter between Hajj Ramadan and Ismail Haniyeh, where Haniyeh thanks Hajj Ramadan for the transfer of $5 million to the Hamas movement. And he asks for, or he discusses how to distribute these funds. There's also indication that in the immediate period preceding Tufan al-Aqsa, the funds had been a bit more limited because there was less available to the IRGC, not because that there was some distance between the movement. In fact, the letters reveal quite the opposite. It should be noted that the resistance has indirectly commented on the release of these letters. It has said that the way these letters were published demonstrates a tendentiousness, but it didn't outright reject that these are that there's veracity to them. I think the speculative conclusion we can reach is that indeed some of these letters are real, if not all of them. However, there's more to these letters. One can also come to the conclusion that although indeed the IRGC and outside actors, including the political outside actors as well as the political bureau of Hamas, did not have word of Tufan al-Aqsa, there was some understanding that there were preparations broadly for military endeavors, but these were more abstract. And this is what Hajj Ramadan had been providing funds for many decades for. Now, I saw you put up this image of Khalid Mashal that I had shared with you. It is from Hajj Ramadan's Twitter account. Believe it or not, he did have one, but it was, I think, not known to many. This tweet has a context behind it that perhaps is worth noting. So, as I had noted in the beginning of the discussion, and as probably will be familiar to many of your listeners, there was this tension concerning the Syria file. The Hamas movement had left its Damascus-based office following the period of tension. There's various accounts of why they left. Some say that there was pressure exerted on the Hamas movement to grant, for Khalid Mashal in particular, who was then the head, to grant some kind of support for the government position, and that Hamas had hewed towards a position of not expressing support for any actor. Others are a bit, other narratives of this period are a bit more at odds with the way that I think the neutrality position has been expressed. Some say that Mishal and others had, in fact, shown more support to the so-called Syrian rebels. But regardless, it is well known that the political office that was then in Damascus is broadly abdicated. There's a few figures that stay, but more or less, most of the officials in the Hamas movement following the 2012 outbreak leave and go to Qatar, to Turkey, to Lebanon, and a few figures to Egypt. This and the following few years, when some figures within the Hamas movement, like Had Mishal, had articulated support for the protesters and the protests' cause, had resulted in, for a very temporary period, lessened funds that the IRGC was allocating to the Hamas movement. One of the claims that was expressed was that the Aknaf Beit al-Maqdis brigades in Syria had served as a conduit for Hamas's military intervention. It included approximately 200 fighters who had, this narrative goes, fought the Syrian army, and also, by the way, the Aknaf Beit al-Maqdis brigades fought the PFLP-GC forces, Fatah, Intifada, and Saika. It was never actually established that there was direct consent by any of the Hamas members in general for Qassam members to join the Aknaf Beit al-Maqdis brigades. There were in fact even condemnations of this from within Gaza leadership. And it should also be noted that within the PFLP, GC, Fatah, Intifada, and Saika, which are groups that were aligned with the Assad government, there were within them factions linked to Hamas's allegiance or alliance of Palestinian forces that had opposed the Oslo Agreement since 1993. So the semblance is just a bit more complex and oftentimes is made out. But the seizure of Yarmouk Palestinian camp by Daesh, by the Islamic State in April 2015, prompts the movement to question those figures like Mishal, to question the rationale of military engagement on the side of the rebels. And this threat leads Mishal to open up dialogue with Ahmad Jibril, who was the Secretary General of PFLP-GC.
This is 2015, the Yarmouk
Yes.
siege? Yeah. Interesting. I didn't know this. I didn't know this about Mishal stepping back. I think you brought it up early. Maybe you brought it up on last conversation. We talked about Mishal because he's a strange character and all this, gets his own strange story of surviving an assassination attempt with the help of the Assad government, which he would then turn on and then leave. So that's, I mean, yeah, I think we talked about that. But yeah, we should. So can you describe the tweet? Because in case people aren't watching, for those who are listening.
Yes, so it should be noted the assassination in 1997 was in Jordan. It was King Hussein of Jordan
Oh,
who,
right, of course, of course.
yes,
But I thought, yeah, that's true. I thought so. Syria played no role in that. No, he left for Syria. Oh yeah, I'm mixing it all up. The Jordanians
yes,
forced the Israelis to give the antidote or something, if I remember correctly. It was
yes.
the Jordanians. Yeah. Damn it, I did stolen valor. I accidentally said something good about Jordan. Damn it.
But it is in 1999 that the political wing of Hamas is expelled from Jordan and goes down to Syria. And Assad welcomes the leadership at this time, providing them with material and significant political support. But we can now turn to this tweet. So this tweet, it takes place in the background of 2021. And in this December 2021 period, this is already after, by the way, the May 2021 Sword of Al-Quds War, which resulted in the concretization in many ways of the post-Syria rift axis of resistance, where there is Hezbollah providing support, intelligence support, to the Qassam brigades. But so on 10 December 2021, Hamza Ibrahim Shahin is a member who's associated with Hamas, and he is martyred. This is after a Friday night explosion in Burj al-Shamali camp near Tyre in southern Lebanon. And according to the existing witness accounts, he was martyred after a Fatah-related targeting, specifically, not he, but those who were associated with the Hamas movement were then targeted by Fatah and Palestinian Authority-affiliated armed men. So the initial explosion itself was broadly described as a blast involving a Hamas arms depot. This is what some claim. Others say that, in fact, it was an electrical short circuit in a store that had oxygen supplies for COVID-19 patients. It's unclear exactly what the cause of the explosion was. But then 2 days later, there's a funeral for Hamza Shahin. And during the funeral procession, Fatah and Palestinian Authority-affiliated armed men in the camp opened fire on the procession. A camp resident, in fact, then goes on to explicate how an armed clash transpired, and that both Fatah and Hamas elements were fighting one another with gunfire exchanged. In any case, following these clashes in December 2021, Khaled Meshal says that he is going to visit Lebanon, the reason being to pay respect to the martyrs following this clash. This is, however, despite Hamas's prior knowledge that Hezbollah would not receive him. Khalil al-Haya had gone to southern Lebanon a week earlier, and he was told by Hezbollah figures that he met with that they would not receive Meshal, or Abu al-Walid as he's known as. And even Hassan Nasrallah sent a message advising this visit not to take place with Meshal. So Hamas's internal position, according to Khalil al-Khaya, was that Meshal should not go, but Meshal insisted. He cited that the martyrs from the Burj al-Shamali incident was enough warrant for him to go pay his respects. Hezbollah and its media ignored this visit, and Hezbollah aligned accounts and media condemned Meshal's insistence on this visit. So Hajj Ramadan at this time tweets that Nasrallah had good reasons for refusing to meet Meshal. It should be known that it was only very recently, in fact, that Meshal was able to, although I should preface this by saying, although even during this period, Meshal had started making statements that the Hamas movement is very thankful for Iran's support. The Hamas movement is broadly aligned with these alliances, indicating a shift from positions he had taken earlier. He then later made statements, and this is following Tufan al-Aqsa and following the Jolani coup, that in fact there is no such thing as an axis of resistance, that this has been something constructed and is not an organic formation. So there has been a lot of shifting in his statements, and this is something that was the cause of contention during this period, hence prompting the tweet. But if you, yes.
Go ahead. No, so this is interesting in the sense that it's a good reminder that even in the years after, it's Syria now, the tragedy of Syria, and just to see that like the CIA and the Mossad are just like in the heart of Islam, and one of the most important sort of places for Islam. It's so heartbreaking, but you realize the scale of this plot and how many actors were part of it and how it was used as a cudgel to break apart so much unity, and only now reemerging from it. It's important that what you pointed out earlier too, that the sword of Al-Quds was an important moment, a sort of enunciation of a healing, a moment of healing, or at least, or like a rift starts to sort of reseal forged in, sacrifice and martyrdom of the people who died in that battle. But it's proof that, I think that was also the joint unity, the joint operations room, I think, that we discussed when, I don't remember what year it was, because the military, Al-Qassam never broke with Iran, or it never broke with Syria during all this, right? That it was a political break first and foremost. Unless, correct me if I'm wrong. Even with the units that went, that were relatively small, Al-Qassam military leadership never went along for the dirty war.
Yes, I think that it's a complicated issue because certainly it is the case that figures like Al-Dayf and Sinwar, Aurori, and others retained important contacts within the axis of resistance. This is exemplary between in 2015. Salah al-Aurori had been living in Turkey. There is then pressure put on the Turkish government to expel him, and he is left politically homeless for a period of time. Said Nasrallah catches word of this and berates some of the Hamas political leadership for not asking him if Salah al-Aurori could come to southern Lebanon, because he says, of course, our doors are open to Salah al-Aurori. Please have him come stay here. And this is what happens. He comes to Lebanon, and that's where he stays until he is martyred. This is just exemplary of one of the connections. You will find, however, reading witness accounts from the Qassam brigades themselves, that insofar as the Syria war is concerned, there was great antipathy towards Assad. That one cannot claim that the Qassam rank and file were at all sympathetic to the government's position or the Syrian Arab Army. This is, I think, just one of the facts that one has to contend with, however, whatever side they fall on in this issue. But then you also have figures like Khalil al-Haya in 2022 seeking to develop a rapprochement with Assad. In fact, this is with Bashar al-Assad and Khalil al-Haya's meeting. There is quite a bit of justification that is given to restoring relations, with al-Haya citing a prophetic hadith about the relationship as a relation of soldiers of the Levant, Junud al-Sham. So there is, it should be noted, these various positions. I only mention the witness accounts because I do think sometimes there is a tendency within those of the anti-imperialist camp to ignore these kinds of rank and file positions and conflate them with the leadership of the Qassam brigades. And it is the case that within the rank and file, within the actual Qassami Mujahideen, you will find different positions, varied positions. You will find those who hew towards more Al-Banna school of the Ikhwan. You will find ones who hew towards Salafism. You will find many different positions, and this is part and parcel of the history of Hamas and more broadly the Islamic movement being a big tent, as I think they call it in English, a large tent or big tent ideological movement that can accompany for various positions. So there is not one univocal position. There is quite some debate that was had and continues to be had. You have a different position expressed by somebody like Yusuf al-Alawi, who is the author of The Seeds of Hamas, a witness account that I have been translating for some time, and someone like al-Aurori or al-Haya. But you also, even within those figures, have certain stances that they take at certain times that I think you could argue are motivated by a kind of political pragmatism, and others that are motivated by more ideological stances.
No, that's good. We are approaching almost 2 hours, and I know it's late for you, so maybe we could sort of make our way towards wrapping up.
Sure. What I think bears some noting here now, after we have covered most of what is known about the relationship between Hajj Ramadan and the Al Qassam brigades, is that this file, this position within the Quds force, has undoubtedly been filled. We don't know by who. This is a good thing, I think, that we don't know by whom, but that there is, as exemplified by the ongoing elections, represented on the one side by Khalil al-Haya, who, although the results have not been released following the Gaza elections, it is broadly thought has won the Gaza bloc, and now the two remaining election blocks are the West Bank and the outside. It's thought that those elections have actually already been completed, and it's just a matter of releasing the results or publishing the results, and Khalid Mishal on the other side. So one should note that there are still some different positions, but there's also significant continuity. The legacy of Hajj Ramadan has undoubtedly been continued. Some think that there are figures like Ahmad Vahidi, who I think is maybe the figure whom the Zionists have the most enmity towards because of his pro-resistance legacy. Some think that he is the figure that is spearheading the Quds Brigade's Palestine file. Others think there are other figures. But it is just worth noting that this is a legacy that continues.
So I appreciate that, and I appreciate all the work you do, Mujamma. I really want to reiterate this, what I said at the beginning, that there is a tendency to criminalize these histories, these names, these stories. There's a tendency to sort of, accept and legitimize the way that Zionist legal apparatus here and their lawfare criminalizes these entities. But it's important to remember these are world histories. We're allowed to talk about important historical figures. We're allowed to discuss their actions, their writings. There's nothing wrong with that. You shouldn't be afraid. And I appreciate all the work you do. Who knows? Maybe you'll get too popular and they'll nuke your account on Substack. That's there is that possibility for all of us, I guess. But I really want to encourage people who are still with us at almost 2 hours, that if you have the languages, if you have the intellectual training or the textual training and bringing this stuff forward, you should work on it. You should try it. Use your time. It's not for everyone. I understand that, and I know people have jobs and careers and they just can't do this. But the more people doing the kind of work you're doing, Mujamma, the safer it is for everyone. And this is something that I speak to in my own field of podcasting and, just whatever, YouTubing and stuff, that the more accounts that share this material, that it's harder for them to stamp it out, that they just kind of give up because it's so normalized. And even if they get us, people see this work, they remember these stories, the names, they Google it, it's in people's knowledge. So the same way they can't erase, the nuclear knowledge of Iranian nuclear scientists, for instance, because it's in people's heads at the end of the day and it's in institutions. They can't erase the knowledge of these figures. It's important to know these figures. And I think you've been a great voice in all this. So I reiterate for the billionth time, and this won't be the last, because I am conscripting you for more of this. More tales of, maybe we should just call this the prehistory of Al-Aqsa flood. Maybe this is episode 2 of prehistory of Al-Aqsa flood, and I'll divide it up into 2 parts because the story of Hajj Ramadan. I said his name incorrectly earlier. Haji, I said it's Hajj Ramadan, and it's an important figure here. And I do also maybe want to say this, and maybe you can close out in terms of response, that there's a strange contradiction in all of this history. Is that on the one hand, these men and these figures are all, you have to recognize their names and their individual contributions, and learn about them, and it's important for a more as you put it, Catholic understanding, maybe holistic understanding, small c, of course. But there is a sort of larger history in all this, is that like these men come, and a lot of them are martyred, a lot of them face martyrdom, and they end, and then somebody else picks up where they left off. So that's part of the story. Interesting story here is that a lot of times we learn about these men after their martyrdom, but their roles in all of this, that there's like a bunch of guys. There's Hajj Ramadan is one guy, but behind him are a bunch of nameless guys who Iranian, Lebanese, Palestinian, Shia, Sunni, like all kinds of figures in all of this who represent a continuum of resistance. So I think episodes like this, even if the names are it's people have to sit down and take notes, and you really have to study from our professor here, Professor Harakat. It's important, and you can study the files and you can find the sources and catch all that stuff yourself. But I really want to thank you again, Mujamma. Please keep up this work. We're looking forward to having you back. But maybe on this closing point of this interesting contradiction of these individual men and noting their contributions, but then against the backdrop of a wider group of men, generations of which who face martyrdom, many of them, thousands, maybe tens of thousands, even more, who continue on it. So is it the one? Is it the many? Like what is the secret to all this? Is it the individuals themselves that are successful here? Is it both? Is there a way to answer that question? It's not really. I guess it depends on how you imagine resistance. Is resistance something big? Is it sociological, or is it something small? Is it people? Is it individuals linking together a wider network?
I think this is a very important question that takes us back to the beginning of the conversation. I think the reason why, for instance, in the shift between Sheikh Zayed and his son, you see this tending towards normalization, the likes of which the region had not previously seen, even amongst those figures who had pursued normalization politics, is because there was not an undergirding ideological, political, populist movement, the likes of which you do find in Iran, which you do find in Gaza, and is why, despite the shifting stances of figures like, say, Khalid Meshal, you still have those who within the political and the military leadership continue the legacy that has been erected for decades past. Still, there are also contradictions to contend with even amongst those figures like Meshal. It should be noted on 11 February 2026, Ali Larijani met with Meshal alongside other leaders of the Hamas delegation, which was headed by Mohammed Darwish, but included Nizar Awadallah, Hussam Badran, Sami Khater, and Bassem Naim. That we had with this meeting another one of the most important, perhaps, demonstrations of Meshal's rapprochement or pursuit with more friendly, amiable relations with Iran. There's also the legacy of of Hajj Ramadan. Public speculation aside, it was articulated by Arshak al-Awasat in March, this past March of 2026, that Iran had appointed a successor to Hajj Ramadan's Palestine file. We know this for a fact.
Sorry for a second. Arshak al-Awasat is the Saudi paper? It's the Saudi paper, right?
I think that I don't think it's Saudi. I think that is owned by a Saudi royal, but I don't know if it's Saudi exactly. I think it is owned by a Saudi
Sorry,
royal, but
it's headquartered in London, England. It is
right.
yeah, that's yeah, it's a weird one. Yeah, go on.
It is
Sorry.
weird because you will get these very different
Yes.
clashing positions. You will get
Yeah,
very
you do.
pro-resistance,
Yeah, you do.
pro-IRGC positions, and then you will get ones that cast
Yeah.
suspicions on Iran. But
It's Ghassan Sharbel. He's the editor of it. Ghassan Sharbel and Arab News. He's also Arab News guy, which is another
interesting.
interesting one. Yeah.
There's within this broadly established continuation, there are three figures that it's considered are continuing the legacy. Vahidi is another figure, but the three that I think most people point to include Ali Shirazi, Majid Zari, and Mustafa Majid Khani, and these are one of these at least, Abu Jawad or Ali Shirazi, he heads the Palestine branch office. So one figure's disappearing from the semblance after his honorable martyrdom does not mean that the genealogy, the legacy crumbles. But at the same time, one should not discount how important these figures, these political figures, are for galvanizing the masses. I think Khalil al-Haya, who just this past week lost his fourth son to a martyrdom as a Qassam fighter, is demonstrative of how interwoven some of these leaders are within the plexus of the Palestinian rank and file.
I mean, I know I was the one who's saying we need to finish because it's late, but I do have to say this too, that to answer my own question is that there's like, why if it's not people, if it's something sociological, right? And it's not, say, I don't know, what's the opposite of sociology? Sociology in my head is like the forest. And if it's not, then is it, if it's the forest, then why isn't the West Bank more active, right? Like if it's then because they've chopped down a lot of the tree resistance trees, to pick up this silly metaphor, but like they've done effective like forest fighting, whatever, like tree cutting in the West Bank way more, where like remember Lion's Den? We don't talk about Lion's Den anymore. Like we don't, like there is no like Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. We haven't heard from them in months. Like they haven't, despite all of the pogroms, despite everything the Zionists do. I mean, Ben Gvir went to, was it the Ibrahimi mosque today? Or no, he went to the Dome of the Rock. I think he went to the Dome of the Rock, and
Yes.
maybe I can't remember. He went to Al-Aqsa, and he just unfurls an entity's flag, right? Like this, if it's. We need to figure out. I mean, we know, but like partly in our minds is, and I think we forget this, and it's important to bring it up. There is a collaborator wing of the Palestinian National Liberationist Movement. There is a comprador wing, and it has effectively and decisively enacted its agenda over what, I mean, millions of West Bank. I mean, how many? What's the population of the West Bank these days? I know they are imprisoned. Basically, I know it's like we're putting on them like an impossible task, and everything that they do to the families of martyrs makes it even harder. So like you're confronting your family's full dispossession, expulsion. Your parents probably will get arrested. Your brothers and sisters will be harassed. So like that, the kind of the costs they inflict upon resistance. I don't mean to minimize that at all, but to go back to my original question of terms of like, how do you get a situation where you have a Mahmoud Abbas and a traitor, like a normalizing traitor scumbag overseeing the like the slow suffocation of the little that's left over Oslo, as he stuffs his face full of Qatari funded shawarma. Like sometimes I think it is the trees. Like it's not the forest. Like if you cut down enough trees, it will work. You'll make the forest bare of any kind of resistance. And Gaza was a place where the trees were allowed to flourish in a sense, whereas the West Bank, beginning with, I don't know, 2000 something, it was like mid 2010s, or I don't know when, assassination of Arafat. Like, I don't know. Maybe maybe this is not the place to open this can of worms, but it makes you wonder. Like, compare and contrast of Gaza and the West Bank in these overlapping or interlapping histories. I don't know. Interfolding. What's the word I'm looking for? Anyways, overlapping. There it is.
Yes, I would say of the 2.7, 2.8 million Palestinians in the West Bank, there's still a significant nexus in, say, Jenin of resistance. And there are those like Zahar Jaberin who oversee the West Bank file. He's responsible for the West Bank file and prisoners file in Hamas. But you're right, of course, that with Abu Mazen and also with the current Fatah leadership, which may be contested by some other flanks, although one can note that the contestation also includes other forms of normalization, like Dahlan, who from the United Arab Emirates is bolstering these collaborator agent gangs like the Hillis gang in the Gaza Strip. So the contestation is not merely on normalization and resistance grounds. So then, of course, there are those who, like the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade in Gaza, have their historical roots in Fatah, but have pursued resistance. I would note that one of the reasons may again have to do with what the political ideology is. Fatah's ideology was broadly Arab nationalism. Maybe Arab nationalism in and of itself cannot countenance and bolster decades-long resistance project, whereas the PFLP's Marxist-Leninism or Hamas's political Islam is in its roots able to have an inherently liberationist telos. I don't think Arab nationalism necessarily has a liberationist telos. Certain renderings of it that hew closer to Marxist-Leninism or to a kind of political Islam may, but in their own core, I don't know that one can identify this as the beating heart of Arab nationalism. I think there's reason to think that there is something to do with not just the trees themselves, but the shape that those trees take, the form that those trees take.
Yeah, yeah, and how like the enemies of Palestinian liberation are not stupid, that they can identify the points of weakness within national liberation movements, within international alliances of liberation movements, like the way they identified Syria as an important node of the resistance, insofar not just connecting Iran to Hezbollah, which always people bring up, and it's the spine, but also as a country itself to be independent, and to sponsoring science. Like for a long time, Syrian scientists and like weapons industry, like they were the backbone of the resistance to Israel. Syria was one of the most Syrian airspace was one of the most advancedly defended airspaces in the world until it was destroyed it's been 15 years and $2 trillion destroying Syria. So it was a great investment for what they did. But anyways, that's going to open up a whole other things. Mujamma, thank you again. I reiterate, I support all your work. Please, everyone, support Mujamma's work. Follow him. It's a free follow. And we'll be back for more prehistory of Al-Aqsa flood. And thank you again for all your great work, Mujamma. And I'm gonna press finish. But give us our final send off. If you have anything to recommend to people or where you want people to check your work out, aside from the Substack, but if you have something that you're working on, for instance.
I would kindly recommend that for all matters in terms of resistance news, people look at Shihab News. That's SHEHABNEWS for Palestinian resistance news. This alongside Ultra Palestine, which is ULTRAPAL ultrasawt.com, will give you the most updated news about the state of affairs within the Palestinian resistance. My own Substack, I try to do archival work, and I am working on several translation efforts. So if the subjects we have discussed interest those who have wish to know a bit more of the deeper history about some of these, I would kindly recommend my Substack. And I thank you very much. Your program is also one of these invaluable resources. I cannot hear you one last time.
One last time. I keep forgetting to press the mute button. Thank you, Mujamma. That means a lot coming from you. And once again, please support Mujamma's work. And we'll see you on another episode of the Prehistory of Al-Aqsa Flood. Thank you, Mujamma.
Inshallah. Thank you.
Inshallah. I'm going to press finish. There we go. Thank